The New Testament in the original Greek. The text revised by Brooke, Foss, Westcott, Canon of Peterborough and Regius, Professor of Divinity, Cambridge, and Fenton, John Anthony Hort, Hulsean, Professor of Divinity, Cambridge, American edition, with an introduction by Philip Scarf, Professor in the Union Theological Seminary, New York, President of the American Bible Revision Committee. Published in 1881 in the Library of Congress, and we found this in the public domain, public access. No copyright infringement was intentional. General contents. Introduction to the American edition by Philip Scarf. Contents of the introduction to the American edition. Introduction to the American edition by Philip Scarf. Merits of the edition. The 17th day of May 1881 marks an epoch in the history of the New Testament. It is the birthday both of the purest English translation and of the purest Greek text of that little book which contains the inspired message of God's wisdom and love to mankind, and which forms the highest standard of Christian faith and duty. The coincidence is remarkable. The original and the translation were matured during the same long period by harmonious though independent cooperation. The editors of the Greek text were members of the English New Testament Company of Revisers. The English and American revisers had the confidential use of advanced proof sheets of this edition of the Greek text as they proceeded, and the translation is perhaps more nearly conformed to it than to any other printed edition from Erasmus and Beza down to Tischendorf and Tregelles. The Textus Receptus, so called, was announced to the world by the Leyden publishers in 1633 with the bold declaration, Textum ergo habes nunc ab omnibus receptum. The author ventures to introduce the Greek Testament, or Philip Scarf ventured to introduce the Greek Testament of Westcott and Hort with the modest assertion, and has there in Latin. It is based exclusively on documentary evidence and on the most careful comparison of all the ancient sources of the text as they have been collected and made available by the indefatigable diligence of former editors, especially of Lachmann, Tischendorf and Tregelles. It embodies the results of the combined labours of more than a quarter of a century. It will of course not supersede the large editions which contain the whole critical apparatus, but it will take its rank at once among the best standard editions of the Greek Testament. Footnote indicator. And it says below, the Saturday Review of London for May 21, 1881, and a notice of the revised version of the New Testament incidentally mentions this Greek edition with the remark, the Clarendon Press volume Archdeacon Palmer's Greek text is beautifully printed. Though this again is eclipsed by the exquisite edition of Dr. Westcott's and Dr. Hort's Greek text, issued by the Pitt Press on the same 17th of May, a day to be much remembered by biblical critics. This last work, formed exclusively on documentary evidence without reference to any printed text, has been long expected by scholars. It is probably the most important contribution to biblical learning in our generation. The revisers, it is understood, had the advantage of consulting it during the progress of their work. So this is ranked at once among the best standard editions of the Greek Testament. Scarf became personally acquainted with the editors and their work 12 years ago. That was probably in 1858 or something like that. 1869, and saw them afterwards repeatedly at Cambridge, London and Peterborough. He formed such a favourable opinion of the value of their labours that he engaged from them and their publisher, Mr. Macmillan, duplicate plates. for an American edition, which is now published by the Messengers, Harper and Brothers. Footnote indication below. The letter of the Messrs. Harper, in which they accepted his proposition, is dated May 17, 1871, on the same day of the same month on which the book was published 10 years afterwards in London. But as Westcott and Hort did not contemplate a critical apparatus below the text, he made subsequently an agreement with his friend Professor Tischendorf for the preparation of an American edition containing his own latest text, with a very brief digest of his critical apparatus, somewhat similar to his Editio Critica Minor, only more condensed and confined to the oldest readings for the use of students, thinking that there would be room for 2 editions, each having its special merits. Tischendorf actually began the work in 1873, and several sheets were set up at Leipzig, when his death in December 1874 ended his earthly labours, preventing him from even preparing the Prolegomena to his 8th critical edition. Scaff knew of no scholars who would better carry out the plan of such an edition than Professor Dr. Ezra Abbott in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Dr. Caspar Rene Gregory in Leipzig. The opinion ripened into conviction by constant use since 1870 of proof sheets of this text in his edition of Lang's Commentary on John. See the critical notes in his exegetical lectures and in his labours as member of the revision committee. Doctors Westcott and Hort were ranked, take note of this, they were ranked in England among the best Greek and biblical scholars of the age. These are those who brought you the New World Translation of the Holy Scriptures, Westcott and Hort. Doctors Westcott and Hort were ranked in England among the best Greek and biblical scholars of the age. Dr. Hort, educated at Rugby School and Trinity College, Cambridge, and is Hulsean Professor of Divinity in the University of Cambridge since 1878. He is probably more familiar with the textual history of the Greek Testament than any other man living. He exerted great influence in the revision company on all matters of reading. His 2 dissertations on, there's some Greek there, and on the Constantinopolitan Creed, 1876, evince a rare degree of patristic learning and critical acumen. Dr. Westcott, born 1825, educated at Trinity College, Cambridge, is Regius Professor of Divinity at Cambridge since 1870 and Canon of Peterborough since 1869. He was the author of several able and useful works as a history of the English Bible, a history of the canon of the New Testament, an introduction to the study of the Gospels, and a commentary on the Gospel of John, which ranked among the best parts of the Speaker's commentary. These 2 scholars had been in constant correspondence with each other and kept a journal of their discussion of all the important textual questions. Few works have ever been prepared with so much labour, care and devotion as this edition of the Greek Testament began in 1853 and finished in 1881. The introduction and appendix, which the editors promised to publish shortly in a separate volume, would contain full exposition of the principles and results of textual criticism, without anticipating the elaborate treatise which Scaff had not yet seen. He proposed, with their consent to furnish the readers of this volume with such preliminary information as is necessary for an intelligent use of this or any other critical edition of the Greek Testament. Literature. The chief authorities for the topics discussed in this introduction are the following. It has a list of all these people. to the following page, right down to the bottom. And onto the next page. The Prolegomena to Tischendorf's 8th critical edition and the introduction and appendix of Westcott and Hort may be referred to in advance as promising the latest and most accurate information on textual criticism applied to the New Testament. 1. Sources of the text of the New Testament. The original autographs, and it has a footnote indicated there. Autographa, and it has it in Greek. At the bottom here. Of the apostolic writings are lost beyond all reasonable hope of discovery, and are not even mentioned by the post-apostolic authors as being extant anywhere or as having been seen by them. Another footnote indicator. On the disputed passage of Tertullian, who speaks of ipsae authenticae literae apostolorum, see Scrivener, page 446. They perished probably before the close of the 1st century, with the brittle paper then in ordinary use. The Egyptian papyrus, like all other ancient writings, with the exception of a few, were accidentally preserved in Egyptian tombs and mummies, or under the lava of Vesuvius at Herculaneum and Pompeii. God has not chosen to exempt the Bible by a miracle from the fate of other books, but has wisely left room for the diligence and research of man, who is responsible for the use of all the facilities within his reach for the study of the Bible. He has not provided for inspired transcribers any more than inspired printers, nor for infallible translators any more than infallible commentators and readers. He wastes no miracles. He desires free and intelligent worshippers. The letter killeth, but the spirit giveth life. The Bible, in its origin and history, is a human as well as a divine book, and must be studied under this twofold aspect. It is the incarnation of God's truth and reflects the divine human person of Christ, to whom it bears witness as the Alpha and Omega, or the Alpha, the Aleph and the Dal. The Alpha and Omega as a way of life, the way, the life and the truth. Even if we had the apostolic autographs, there would be room for verbal criticism, since they, like other ancient books, were written as a continuous whole. I mean, there was no breaks in between them like we have today, and no chapter numbers, etc. Without accents, without punctuation, without division of sentences or words, without titles and subscriptions, without even the name of the author, unless it was part of the text itself. In the absence of the autographs, we must depend upon copies or secondary sources, but these are fortunately far more numerous and trustworthy for the Greek Testament than for any ancient classic. In the variety and fullness of the evidence on which it rests, the text of the New Testament stands absolutely and unapproachably alone among ancient prose writings. W&H, that'd be Westcott and Hort, page 561. The sources of the text are threefold: manuscript, copies, ancient versions, and patristic quotations. 1. The Greek manuscripts. The manuscripts, or codices, footnote indicator down the bottom, footnote down the bottom, explains about codices, and it reads: codex, or codex, means originally the trunk of a tree, stock, stem, then a block of wood split or sawn into planks, leaves, or tablets, and fastened together. Hence a book, as the ancients wrote on tablets of wood smeared with wax, the leaves being laid upon one another. The Hebrew manuscripts are in rolls. The sources of the text are threefold: manuscript copies, ancient versions, and patristic quotations. The Greek manuscripts. The manuscripts or codices are the direct and most important sources. They number now over 1,700, counting all classes, and new ones may yet be discovered. Footnote indicator. There. And look at the bottom. To see what it has to say. The total number of manuscripts recorded by Dr. Scrivener, including lectionaries, is 158 uncials and 1,605 cursives. Page 269, compare PX. But his list is incomplete. He gives an index of about 1,277 separate Greek manuscripts of the New Testament arranged according to the countries where they are now deposited. Paragraph 571 to 584. He assigns 3 to Denmark, 293 to England, 238 to France, 96 to Germany, 6 to Holland, 3 to Ireland, 368 to Italy, 81 to Russia, 8 to Scotland, 23 to Spain, 1 to Sweden, 14 to Switzerland, 104 to Turkey, 39 unknown. See also Edward C. Mitchell, Critical Handbook, Tables 8, 9 and 10. The codices differ in age, extent and value. They were written between the 4th and 16th centuries. The oldest date from the middle of the 4th century and rest of course on still old copies. It's talking about the Greek manuscripts or Greek texts here. Few manuscripts of Greek or Roman classics are older than the 9th or 10th century. The Medicaean MS or manuscript of Virgil is of the 4th century. The Vatican manuscript of Dion Cassius of the 5th. The oldest manuscript of Aeschylus and Sophocles date from the 10th. Those of Euripides from the 12th century. The oldest completely copy of Homer is from the 13th century, though considerable papyrus fragments have been recently discovered which may date from the 5th or 6th. Some manuscripts cover the whole New Testament, some only parts, and hence they are divided into 5 or 6 classes according as they contain the Gospels, or the Acts, or the Catholic epistles, or the Pauline epistles, or the Apocalypse, or only the scripture lessons from the Gospels or Acts and epistles, the lectionaries. Those which cover more than one of these classes or the whole New Testament are numbered in the lists 2, 3 or more times. The Gospel manuscripts are the most numerous, those of the Apocalypse the least numerous. Some manuscripts are written with great care, some contain many errors of transcribers. Most of them give the Greek text only, a few the Latin version, also hence called codices bilinguis or Greco-Latini. For example, Codice D or BC for the Gospels and Acts, Codice D Claromonatus for the Pauline epistles, and Cod, some sort of triangle there, Sangalensis for the Gospels. They are written in the East, mostly in Alexandria and Constantinople, for in Europe, with the exception of Greece, Lower Italy and Sicily, the knowledge of the Greek language disappeared after the 5th century till the revival of learning in the 15th, and the Latin Vulgate supplied the place of the Greek and Hebrew Bible. Some words of frequent occurrence are usually abridged, and gives you an example of these in the Greek. The manuscripts are divided into 2 classes, uncial and cursive. The former are written in large or capital letters, litera unciales or majusculae. The latter in small letters, literae minuscula, or in current hand. The uncial manuscripts are older, from the 4th to the 10th century, and hence more valuable, but were discovered and used long after the cursive. 2 of them, the Sinaitic and the Vatican, date from the middle of the 4th century. A. Unsealed manuscripts. The unsealed manuscripts are designated since Wittstein, 1752, for the sake of brevity, by the capital letters of the Latin alphabet A, B, C, D, etc., with the help of Greek letters for a few manuscripts beyond Codex Z and the Hebrew letter Aleph for the Sinaitic manuscript, which was discovered last and precedes Codex A. Footnote indication there. The present usage arose from the accidental circumstance that the Codex Alexandrinus was designated as Codex A in the lower margin of Walton's polyglot. Scrivener Locksit, page 72, second edition. A far better system would be to designate them. In the order of the age or value, which would place B and this alpha in the Greek before A, but the usage in this case can as little be altered as the traditional division into chapters and verses. Mill cited the copies by abridgments of their names, for example, Alex, Kant, Mont, but this mode would now take too much space. Wittstein knew 14 unsealed manuscripts of the Gospels, which he designated from A to 0, and about 112 cursives, besides 24 evangelistaries. See is listed at the close of the Prolegomena, paragraph 220 to 222. The unseals are written on costly and durable vellum or parchment, on quarto or small folio pages of 1 or 2, very rarely of 3 or 4 columns. The older ones have no division of words or sentences, except for paragraphs, no accents or ornaments, and but very few pause marks. Hence it requires some practice to read them with ease. The date and place which were not marked on manuscripts rather than earlier than the 10th century can be only approximately ascertained from the material, the form of letters, the style of writing, the presence or absence of the Ammonian sections. It has it here in the Greek, in the Latin capitula, in the Gospels, the Eusebian canons or tablets of references to the Ammonian sections after 340 when Eusebius died, the Euthalian sections in the Acts and Epistles, and the stichometric divisions or lines. It's in the Greek here, corresponding to sentences both introduced by Euthalius, circulation AD 458, and footnote indicated there. Afterwards, these stichometric divisions were abandoned as too costly and gave way to dots or other marks between the sentences. This was the beginning of punctuation. Okay, both introduced by Euthalius, circulation AD 458, marks of punctuation 9th century, etc. Sometimes a second or third hand was introduced. Second or third hand has introduced punctuation and accents or different readings. Hence the distinction of lections, etc., etc., marked by a asterisk, etc., etc. In some manuscripts, as Codex C, P, Q, R, Z, and the symbol here, have been written twice over owing to the scarcity and costliness of parchment, and are called codices prescripti or palimpsests. It's in the Greek there. The new book being written between the lines or across or in place of the old Bible text. So it's like, say if you had this text here, what they've done, looks like they've rubbed it out and written over it. Constantine the Great ordered from Eusebius for the churches of Constantinople the preparation of 50 manuscripts of the Bible to be written on artificially wrought skins by skillful calligraphers. There's a footnote indicated here. It says down the bottom, Eusebius Vita Constantinople 436. It has it in Greek, and it has something here, Scrivener Introduction, page 72, second edition, 1874. So yeah, these are especially skillful calligraphists or scribes or writers, right? Copyists. To judge from this fact, the number of uncials was once very large, but most of them perished in the Middle Ages. The whole number now known as less than 100. Scrivener reckons 56 for the Gospels, most of them only fragments, 14 for the Acts and so forth. It's right down the bottom here, all this information. Okay, here's Dr. Abbott's list as follows. It continues. Whole number of distinct manuscripts. The Sinaitic and the Vatican manuscripts are by far the most important for antiquity, completeness and value. Scaff gives a brief description of the best uncial manuscript, which are most frequently quoted by critics. 1. Uncials of the first class. They are 4, 2 from the 4th, 2 from the 5th century, 1 complete, 2 nearly complete, A and B, and so forth. And it continues. And here's a really long footnote. Professor C. Tischendorf in the convent of St. Catherine at the foot of Mount Sinai on the 4th of February 1859. It's probably when a manuscript was found. Maybe this Codex Sinaiticus. It was published at St. Petersburg, printed at Leipzig at the expense of the Tsar Alexander II in celebration of the first millennium of the Russian Empire in accurate imitation by type. And it's got this long story here. The story of this discovery, which made Tischendorf one of the happiest men Philip Scaff even known, reads like an heroic romance. His 3 journeys from Leipzig to Mount Sinai in pursuit of manuscript treasures in 1844, 1853 and 1859. His first rescue of 43 leaves of the Septuagint from a wastebasket in the convent of St. Catherine in 1844. His final discovery of the whole Codex Sinaiticus in 1859, with the powerful aid of the recommendation of that noble Tsar who met such terrible death at the hands of the Nihilists in 1881. His patient labour in transcribing it at Cairo and in its publication at Leipzig in connection with a great national event of the Russian Empire. His controversy with the Greek Simonides, who impudently claimed to have written the Codex on Mount Athos in 1839 and 1840, are all told by himself, not without some excusable vanity, in his Reise in den Orient 1845-46 and Aus dem Heilande 1862 and so forth, and went on a visit to Mount Sinai in March 1877. Scaff maybe saw a copy of the magnificent 4-volume edition in the convent library and mentioned the name of Tischendorf. The sub-prior kindled up in indignation and called him a thief who had stolen the greatest treasure on the pretext of a temporary loan. And when he reminded him of the large reward of the Emperor of Russia, who had furnished a new silver shrine for the coffin of St. Catherine, he admitted it reluctantly, but remarked that they did not want the silver but the manuscript which these monks could read and were at one time ready to throw into the fire. After long delays, the manuscript was formally presented to the Tsar in 1869 by the new prior, Archbishop Kallistratos, and the monks of the convents of St. Catherine and Cairo. See Tischendorf, the Sinai Bible, 1871. It'll be like the Sinai Bible, page 91. Okay, it's cast in 4 folio volumes. The New Testament was also separately edited by Tischendorf in smaller type in quarto, Leipzig 1863, in 4 columns and so forth. And this codex is the most complete, and also with the exception perhaps of the Vatican manuscripts, the oldest, or at all events one of the 2 oldest manuscripts or that it was last found and used. This is be a Greek manuscript, right? Tischendorf calls it, and it's all in Latin here. He assigns it to the age of Eusebius, the historian, who died in 340, and thinks it not improbable that it was one of the 50 copies which Constantine had ordered to be prepared for the churches of Constantinople in 331, and that it was sent by the Emperor Justinian to the convent of Mount Sinai, which he founded. And here's here Tischendorf's edition of the English New Testament, Leipzig 1869, page 12. After a more careful inspection of the Vatican manuscript in 1866, he has somewhat modified his view of the priority of the Sinaitic over the Vatican manuscript, and assigns them both to the middle of the 4th century, maintaining even that one of the scribes of who wrote 6 leaves and who designates D wrote the New Testament part of B. Just talking about codices. Compare the learned and very able essay of Dr. Ezra Abbott against Mr. Burgon, Comparative Antiquity of the Sinaitic and Vatican Manuscripts, in the Journal of the American Oriental Society, Volume 10, 1872, paragraph 189 to 200. Gebhardt and Herzog's Real Encyclopedia, New Edition, Volume 2, page 414, pronounces Burgon's attempt to prove the higher antiquity of the Vatican manuscript by 50 to 100 years as an entire failure. Okay, this manuscript, Codex X we call it, right? It's got that funny symbol there, contains large portions of the Old Testament in the Septuagint version, 199 leaves, and the whole New Testament without any omission, anything left out of it or taken out of it, removed from it, together with the Epistle of Barnabas, all in Greek. So is that Epistle of Barnabas supposedly that letters of Pilate or something like that? All in Greek. And a part of the Pastor Hermai in Greek, 147.5 leaves. It is so much disfigured by numerous corrections made by the original scribes or several later writers, especially one in the 4th century, whose emendations are very valuable, and one of the 7th. It often confirms Codex Vaticanus in characteristic readings, as all this information here. And it has contributed very much towards the settlement of the text and stimulated the progress of the revision movement in England, in connection with Tischendorf's Tauschnick's edition of King James Version 1869, which gives in footnotes the chief readings of the 3 great uncials. Is that symbol again? And B and A. Must be the codexes. Tischendorf first copied the Sinaitic manuscript with the help of Coptic scribes at Cairo, and from this copy, which the professor showed Schaff at Leipzig, the printed editions were prepared, as neither Tischendorf nor his scribes were infallible. Some errors may have crept in, so they were susceptible to making errors, right? Mistakes, copying mistakes, etc. Some errors may have crept in, so that in doubtful cases a resort to the original manuscript in St. Petersburg is necessary. Chigalis has inspected it. Considerable portions of it have been photographed, and real facsimiles are given in Tischendorf's 3 editions and in Scrivener's introduction. Mr. Burgon, also in his book on the last 12 verses of Mark, gives an exact facsimile of a page taken at St. Petersburg, which shows the last 2 columns of Mark to 16:8, Mark 16:8, and the first columns of Luke, and here it's in the Greek. It's a specimen of the Codex Sinaiticus, containing 1 Timothy 3:16, and here it is in the Greek. And it goes on about Codex Alexandrinus of the 5th century, and Codex A the first uncial manuscript that was used by textual critics. It presents a text which occupies an intermediate position between the oldest uncial and the later text. And Codex Vaticanus of the middle of the 4th century on very fine thin vellum, in small but clear and neat uncial letters in 3 columns of 42 lines each, to a quarto page, 10 inches, etc., etc. And some more specimens of the Codex Alexandrinus. And the Sinaitic manuscript, but not so complete. Okay, that's all this information here. And it carries on in that style, giving all this information in the Greek. And says something about the text of Codex Bezae or Cantabrigiensis in the library of the University of Cambridge, to which Beza presented it in 1581. It dates from the 6th century and contains only the Gospels and Acts, with a Latin version edited by Thomas Kipling, Cambridge 1793. 2 volumes, folio, and more accurately by Dr. Scrivener in common type with a copious introduction and critical notes, Cambridge 1864. The text is very peculiar and puzzling. It has many bold and extensive interpolations, for example a paragraph after Luke 6:4, which is found nowhere else. On the same day he, Jesus, beheld a certain man working on the Sabbath, and said unto him, Man, blessed art thou if thou knowest what you've done, or what you're doing. But if you don't know, you are cursed and a transgressor of the law. It differs more than any other from the received Greek text, but maybe that's the Textus Receptus, but it often agrees in remarkable readings with the ancient Latin and Syriac versions. Alfred, maybe issue 110, or it's got I there, 110, thinks that it was written in France by a Latin transcriber ignorant of Greek. Beza procured it from the monastery of St. Irenaeus at Lyons in 1562, but did not use it on account of its many departures from other manuscripts. Tregellus remarks that its evidence, when alone, especially in editions, is of scarcely any value as to the genuine text, but of the very greatest when corroborated by other very ancient authority. 2. Uncials of the 2nd class, defective and of later date. D. For the Pauline epistles, Codex Claromontanus of the 6th century, defective but very valuable, in the National Library at Paris, edited by Tischendorf, Leipzig, 1852. Beza procured it from Clermont and made some use of it, 1582. It is Greek and Latin, stichometric, with accents by a later hand, but no division of words. E. For the Gospels, Codex Basilensis, 8th century, in the library at Basilic, defective in Luke. Erasmus overlooked it. Collated by Tischendorf, 1843. Müller and Tregellus, 1846. It is better than most of the 2nd class uncials. It approaches to the Textus Receptus. E. For the Acts, Codex Laudianus in Oxford, with a close Latin version on the left column, of the 6th century, probably brought from Tarsus to England by Theodore of Canterbury, died 1690, and used by the Venerable Beda, died 735. And it's got all this information, these different manuscripts, etc., and what century they belong to, and so forth. The ancient versions, Next to the study of the manuscripts, the most important aids in textual criticism are the ancient versions or translations of scriptures from the Hebrew and Greek into vernacular languages. It's probably a more modern form or translation. They are, however, only indirect sources, as we must translate them back into the original, except in omissions and additions which are apparent at once. And it goes on about that. While the interpreter of the New Testament will be fully justified in setting aside without scruple the authority of early versions, there are sometimes ambiguous passages in which a version may preserve the traditional sense. John 1:39, 8:25, etc., and so forth. It matters comparatively little whether they be elegant or wretched, so long as they reflect with accuracy the original text. One service of great importance they can be manifestly dependent upon to render, to tell where insertions or omissions occur in the original text before the translator. It is therefore satisfactory evidence against the genuineness of any particular passage that it is not found in the most ancient versions. The most important of these versions are the Syriac, the Old Latin, the Vulgate, the Ethiopic, the Egyptian, the Gothic, and the Armenian. A. Syriac versions. A. The Peshitta, the simple, so called because of its fidelity to the Greek, dates in its old form, see below, Curetonian, from the middle of the 2nd century. It supplied the wants of the Syrian Christians before the unhappy schism in that church, 5th century, and by its use in common has always been a bond of union between the different sects who still read it as a sacred classic, although its language is no longer the vernacular. So it's not this derivative or this modern language, it's probably gone back to its supposed original. The Peshitta is the most faithful and accurate of the older versions and has been called the Queen of Versions. Yet this mentor translator Victor N. Alexander was told by a priest of the Apostolic Church of the East Restored that they don't use it because it's botched. And maybe what they had was a botched version. They don't like it. Even Andrew Gabriel Roth at the AramacScriptures.com, he avoided it as well, and the Latin versions and so forth. It is almost literal yet idiomatic and really loose and paraphrastic. It is very important to the critic. The text connects it with many places. The text connects it in many places with Codex D and the Latin versions. Notwithstanding its age and value, it was not known to Europe until 1552, and in 1555 at Vienna the first edition appeared at the expense of the Emperor Ferdinand I, edited by Albert Widmanstadt, the Imperial Chancellor. This edition is yet highly esteemed. The best modern editions, although none are superior, are those of Professor Lee, printed by the British and Foreign Bible Society, and of William Greenfield and Bagster's Polyglot, and separately. The peculiarity of the Peshitta version, and a proof of its early date, is its omission of 2 Peter, 2 and 3 John, Jude, and the Apocalypse. Dr. Murdoch has published a literal translation from the Syriac Peshitta version, New York, 1851. A translation of the Acts and Epistles from the Peshitta by J. W. Etheridge appeared in London, 1849. B. The Philoxenian or Harclaean version, so called from its patron Philoxenus, Monophysite, Bishop of Marburg, here Apuleius in eastern Syria, 488 to 515, and from Thomas of Hakel, a subsequent editor, who was likewise a Monophysite, Bishop of Marburg. It is probably the most servile version of Scripture ever made. Scrivener. It is based upon the Peshitta and forces it into rigorous conformity with the letter of the Greek at the expense of the spirit. It dates from AD 508 and was revised by Thomas of Harkle 616. It contains the whole New Testament except the Apocalypse, it's probably Revelation, and is therefore more complete than the Peshitta, which omits 4 epistles. Besides, the only edition of the Philoxenian is that of Joseph White, printed by the Clarendon Press, Oxford, 1778 to 1803, 4 volumes, 4to. Bernstein has published the Gospel of John, Leipzig, 1853. And then you have the Curetonian Syriac, which is a mere fragment of the Gospels, consisting of 82.5 leaves, but very old and valuable, though overestimated by Canon Cureton, who thought it retained to a great extent the identical terms and expressions of St. Matthew's Hebrew Gospel. It is regarded by most scholars as Cureton, Payne Smith, Hermanson, Ewald, Crowfoot, Tregellis and Westcott and Hort as the oldest form of the Syriac version, the Peshitta in its present form holding a relation to it similar to that of the Vulgate to the Old Latin. You have to go do some research on that one. It's probably saying like the Greek Syriac type version, right? Not too sure on that one. Dean Alford calls it the earliest said most important of all versions. Dr. Scrivener, however, places it decidedly below the Peshitta. It was found by Archdeacon Tatum in 1842, with 550 other manuscripts, in a convent of the Nitrian Desert, 70 miles northwest of Cairo, and brought to the British Museum and was published by Cureton in 1858 with a literal English translation. It agrees remarkably with Codex D and the Old Latin, while the Peshitta mostly favours A. It contains large portions of Matthew, Luke and John and the last 4 verses of Mark. Dr. Brooke, the celebrated Egyptologist, afterwards discovered 3 additional leaves in the binding of a manuscript of the Peshitta, which came from the Nitrian convent, 1871. They were published by Rudiger in the Monatsbericht of the Berlin Academy, etc. The Curetonian Syriac, including these new leaves, has been translated into Greek by J.R. Crowfoot in Fragmenta Evangelica, 2 parts, London, 1870-71 and 72. D. The Jerusalem Syriac. The principal manuscript known is an Evangelistory in the Vatican, dated AD 1030. This has been published at Verona, 1861-64, 2 volumes, 4-2, by Count Francis Miniscalchi Rizzo. Fragments of 2 other manuscripts are in the British Museum, and of 2 more at St. Petersburg. The text of these has been published by Land and Sedota Syriaca, Volume 4, 1875. The version is quite independent of the Peshitta and is referred by Tischendorf to the 5th century. It is in a peculiar dialect and seems to have been little used. Wonder why. Okay, then you have Latin versions. A. The Old Latin Itala. This version is not found complete, but from the quotations of the Latin fathers, especially those of Tertullian, Cyprian, Lucifer of Cagliari, Hilary of Poitiers, Hilary the Deacon, or Ambrosiaster, Ambrose, etc., etc. And in the Apocalypse Primasius, its text can be in large measure restored. The version is nearest in age to the Peshitta and may be assigned to the middle of the 2nd century. Stop fighting. Hey! Okay, here's some information here. The Latin Vulgate. In the course of time, the text of the Old Latin became so corrupt that a thorough revision was imperative, and was entrusted by Pope Damascus in 382 to Jerome, died 419, the most learned scholar of his day, and of all the Latin fathers best qualified by genius, taste and knowledge of Hebrew and Greek for this difficult task. He began upon the New Testament and proceeded cautiously, making as few changes as possible, so as not to arouse the opposition of those who, as he says, thought that ignorance was holiness. But his scholarly instincts, no less than his convictions of duty towards the divine word, impelled him to go beyond his instructions and make a new version of the Old Testament directly from the Hebrew, of which, however, it does not concern us at present to speak of this particular author. Jerome's revision and new translation, finished 405, encountered much opposition, which greatly irritated his temper and betrayed him into contemptuous abuse of his opponents, whom he styled bipedus Euselos. But by inherent virtues rather than by external authority, it passed into such current use that in the 8th century it was the Vulgate, the common version in the Western churches. So his translation ended up becoming the Vulgate. It became much corrupted by frequent copying. Alcuin, at the instance of Charlemagne, revised it around 802 by the collation of various good manuscripts, and substantially in this form it passed down into the invention of printing. So it was quite badly corrupted according to this. The first book printed was the Vulgate, the so-called Mazarin Bible, Gutenberg and Fust, Mayence, 1455. Printing, however, fixed errors and gave them wider currency, and revision was felt once more to be imperative. In the Council of Trent, December 13, 1545 to December 4, 1563, the matter was introduced. Feb 4, 1546, and the recommendation of revision passed on April 8th. But it was not until 1590, in the pontificate of Sixtus V, that the revised edition of the Vulgate appeared. So they must have gone all out to fix it, right, to correct it of its errors. The scholarly Pope took active interest in the work, rejecting or confirming the suggestions of the Board of Revisers, or revisionists, right, and corrected the proof sheets with his own hand. It was prefaced by the famous and, as the event showed, by no means infallible Constitution Aeternus Ille, dated March 1, 1589, in which the Pope said, "By the fullness of apostolic power, we decree and declare that this edition of the Sacred Latin Vulgate of the Old and New Testaments, which has been received as authentic by the Council of Trent, be received and held as true, legitimate, authentic, and unquestioned in all public and private disputation, reading, preaching, and explanation." So up here it says that this Pope took active interest in it, rejecting or confirming the suggestions of the Board of Revisers or Revisionists, and corrected the proof sheets with his own hand. This Pope further forbade any alteration whatever, ordered this text and none other henceforth to be printed. So once he created a proof sheet, that was it. No one could mess with it. He further forbade any alteration whatever, ordered this text and none other henceforth to be printed, and hurled anathemas. It's like not quite curses, but it's like a bit of wrath against these guys, these other people, against everyone disobeying the Constitution. But alas for the Pope, the Immaculate Edition was full of errors and blunders, and no sooner was he dead, so it was still full of blunders, right? August 27th, 1590, then a demand for a new edition arose. So they had the revisers again, supposedly, we're guessing. Bellarmine suggested an ingenious, though dishonourable, escape from the awkward predicament in which Sixtus had placed the Church. That a corrected edition should be hastily printed under the name of Sixtus, in which the blame of the errors should be thrown upon the printer. So this Pope might have made a mess of it, and they blamed the printer, scapegoat. His recommendation was adopted, but it was not until 1592 under Clement VIII that the revised edition appeared. The Clementine edition is the standard in the Roman Catholic Church, in which this Latin translation takes precedence of the Hebrew and Greek originals as a support of doctrine and guide of life. So they're not referring to the Hebrew and the Greek, they're referring to the Latin, right? Is what it's saying there. The materials for a more critical edition of the Vulgate than the Clementine are very abundant. There are numerous manuscripts, and much labour has already been expended upon the work. The most famous of these manuscripts are A. Codex Amiatinus from the Cistercian monastery of Monte Amiatino in Tuscany, now in the Laurentian Library at Florence. It contains the Old and New Testaments, also almost complete, dates from 541, and is the oldest and best manuscript. The New Testament was edited by Tischendorf, Leipzig, 1852, second edition, 1854, and by Tregales as the edition of the Greek Testament with the variations of the Clementine text. B. Codex Fuldensis in the Abbey of Fulda, Hesse Castle, contains the New Testament, dates from 546, collated by Lachmann for his large edition of the Greek Testament, and edited by E. Rank, Marburg, and Leipzig, 1868. C. Codex Juliensis, and so forth. The best edition of the variations is that of Carlo Vercelloni, Varia Lectiones Vulgate, Latin, and so forth, Biblical edition, 1860, and so forth. But unfortunately, without either the authorized or the corrected text. Fritzke says, even today there is wanting a text which answers the demands of science, and Protestantism alone can and ought to be to accomplish this work already too long neglected. And you got the Ethiopic version. There must have been a call for a translation of the New Testament very shortly after Christianity entered Abyssinia. Is that the other name for Ethiopia? So, although the original name probably, or the Greek name given, right? So although the tradition which assigns it to Abba Salama through Mentius, the first bishop, be unreliable, the version probably dates from the 4th century, as Dillman asserts. This scholar likewise praises the version for its fidelity and general smoothness. The New Testament has been edited by Thomas Pell Platt for the British and Foreign Bible Society, 1826-30. But unfortunately it is almost useless for critical purposes because so dependent upon recent manuscripts. Gildemeister, professor in Marburg, collated some portions of the Ethiopic New Testament for Tischendorf's edition of 1859. D. Old Egyptian or Coptic versions. These are in two dialects, the Thabaic or Sahidic and the Memphitic or Balhairic. So it looks like a B. They are, Bishop Lightfoot declares in his footnote at the bottom, he prepared the chapter on the Egyptian versions in Dr. Scrivener's introduction, paragraph 319 to 357. Okay, Copt is probably an Arab transformation of the Greek, he's got it there, and is applied to the Christian inhabitants of Egypt who inherited the old Egyptian Demotic language together with their religion. We have found what this may mean in the Aramaic translated Victor Alexander's translation project. We can post it underneath our video if we go and have a look and find it again. Probably pretty similar to this explanation here. We think it might have a little bit of difference, be a little bit different. The former is rougher, less polished, and less faithful to the original than the latter, or the later, right? Both contain many Greek words and are of great textual value as they independently preserve a very ancient text from different manuscripts, with the adoption of many Greek words. Schwarzer and Lightfoot infer from historical notices that the greatest part of the New Testament, if not all, was translated into the Egyptian dialects in the 2nd century. We have no satisfactory edition of either version. And then it has the edito principes of the Mephitic version for Lower Egypt is that of Wilkins, Oxford 1716, based upon copious materials but not carried out with much critical sagacity. Still nothing better than its work has yet appeared except an edition of the Four Gospels by M.G. Schweitzer, Leipzig 1846 and 1847, 2 volumes, and so forth. So it's really getting into these different manuscripts. And you've got a Gothic version, Armenian version, patristic quotations, and he's got something here on the Greek fathers. 1st century, the apostolic fathers, so-called Clement of Rome, Polycarp, Ignatius, Barnabas, would, as pupils of the apostles, be the oldest and most important witnesses, but they still lived in the element of oral tradition within the hearing of the apostles, and hence they quote few passages from the New Testament. 2nd century, Justin Martyr, died 167, comes next in the order of time. It makes much use of the Four Gospels, but in a very free and loose way. Irenaeus of Lyons, died 202, is the most important witness of the 2nd century, and his great work against the Gnostic heresies is replete with scripture knowledge, but exists for the most part only in Latin version. And footnote indicated, so it's a footnote at the bottom. He testifies, for example, to the last 12 verses of Mark, and to the existence of 2 readings of the mystic number in Revelations 13:18. The one is 666 or 666, which he found is in the best copies, and explains to mean Latinos, while several modern exegetists make it out to mean in Hebrew letters Neron Caesar. The other 616, which is the numerical value of Nero without the final, is that in? Caesar. Mr. Peachy or Caesar, right? Maybe that's a Caesar. It's got Caesar there. So we're trying to work this one out here. Several modern exegetists make it out to mean in Hebrew letters Neron Caesar. The other 616, which is the numerical value of Nero without the final N. Now we see what it is. So it's not Neron Caesar. Okay, they left that N out, so it's Nero Caesar. Tried to say he's that man, that's that Antichrist or the beast, right? 666. Okay, and has something about Augustine, a profound divine and spiritual commentator, but a poor linguist and critic, died 430, and most of all Jerome, the translator of the Latin Bible from the original Hebrew and Greek, died 419. The variations and textual criticisms, origins of variations, number of variations, value of variations, and there's a really long footnote here. What's this? Anglo-American Bible Revision, page 92. In the later article, Sunday School Times, Philadelphia, May 28, 1881. Where's this footnote indication, right? What's it got here? Dr. Ezra Abbott makes a similar assertion, or an assertion with special reference to the English revision of the Textus Receptus. He makes a similar assertion with special reference to the English revision. This host of various readings may startle one who is not acquainted with the subject, and he may imagine that the whole text of the New Testament is thus rendered uncertain, but a careful analysis will show that 19/20ths of these are of no more consequence than the palpable errata in the first proof of a modern printer. They have so little authority, or so manifestly false, that they may be at once dismissed from consideration. Of those which remain, probably 9/10 are of no importance as regards the sense. The differences either cannot be represented in the translation or affect the form of expression merely, not with the essential meaning of the sentence. Though the corrections made by the revisers in the Greek text of the New Testament, followed by our translators, probably exceed 2,000. Hardly 1/10 of them, perhaps not 1/20th, will be noticed by the ordinary reader. Of the small residue, many are indeed of sufficient interest and importance to constitute one of the stronger reasons for making a new revision, which should no longer suffer the known errors of copyists to take the place of the words of the evangelists and apostles. But the chief value of the work accomplished by the self-denying scholars who have spent so much time and labour in the search for manuscripts and in their collation or publication does not consist, after all, in the corrections of the text which have resulted from their researches. These corrections may affect a few of the passages which have been relied on for the support of certain doctrines, but not to such an extent as essentially to alter the state of the question. Still less is any question of Christian duty touched by the multitude of various readings. The greatest service which the scholars who have devoted themselves to critical studies and the collection of critical materials have rendered has been the establishment of the fact that on the whole the New Testament writings have come down to us in a text remarkably free from important corruptions, even in the late and inferior manuscripts on which the so-called received text was founded, while the helps which we now possess for restoring it in its primitive purity far exceed those which we enjoy in the case of any eminent classical author whose works have come down to us. The multitude of various readings which to the thoughtless or ignorant seem so alarming is simply the result of the extraordinary richness and variety of our critical resources. Classes of variations. The variations which really involve the sense may, with Dr. Chigalis, be reduced to three classes: omissions, or additions, or substitutions of words or phrases. He goes on about omissions and additions in great depth. So there's some interest here. The passage of the three heavenly witnesses, John 7:8, and it comes down here and it says the internal evidence is likewise against it, since John would not have written the Father and the Word and the Holy Spirit, but the Father and the Son, or God and the Word, etc. Hence it is universally given up by critics. And down here it has, even Dr. Scrivener, one of the most conservative critics, says, page 561, to maintain the genuineness of this passage is simply impossible. More than 50 volumes and pamphlets have been written on this controversy. Well, in the Galilean Aramaic, New Testament actually says the Multha. Okay? This Greek logos is wrong. It means Multha. It originally had Multha, which meant the manifestation of God. And it was a sacred term by these scribes, and according these texts, right? And also said by the later born Aramaic translator from Mesopotamia, Syria, Victor Alexander, is incorrect. Originally, the word was milta, or milta, not logos. This is a very good book about all these different Greek and Hebrew manuscripts.